Hi, I'm early, but I just figured I'd log
No
on
problem.
and do something else in the meantime.
No worries. Welcome.
But I really am enjoying the class.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. So I'm trying to teach myself to draw and do watercolors because I retired on February 10th.
Mm-hmm.
I like to stay home more. I didn't expect it would be this much. But, you know, this is one of the things I planned to do. So I already had everything ready to get
Right.
started. So, but boy, the black and white drawings are okay, but getting the right colors,
Yeah.
50 million shades of green, and
Absolutely.
it's a real challenge, and I don't really think, you know, I'm not the kind of person that's always doodling or drawing. You know,
Right.
it doesn't come naturally.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that anybody can learn how. Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, and you?
Very good.
So here we are.
Here we are again.
There's
Part
people
3.
joining. There's people coming on.
Good morning, Sharon.
Still early. Yeah, it's still early and people are already coming on.
What was interesting this morning is on CNN, they've had a lot of technical problems.
Oh, I haven't seen the news today.
Yeah, no, you know, I have it glued on CNN for
I usually do too.
too many hours a day.
Way too many, but yes.
And they've been having a lot of technical little glitches today.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, because they usually don't.
No, usually they're pretty slick. You're right.
So
Probably
anyhow,
the regular guy is on a vacation or
yeah,
something.
that's what I was thinking. It's the weekend crew.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
That does make sense.
yeah, I was just watching Meet the Press, you know. I like to hear Meet the Press.
Who was on this morning?
Well, they had a senator from Iowa that they were interviewing. And then I came in on the panel. I'm trying to remember who came on earlier. I was half listening to it and getting dressed, so I heard it. Oh, it was someone from the CDC, but not Fauci. You know, it was all Corona all the time.
Just like our lives.
Exactly.
And I like to listen to the PBS NewsHour, you know, on weekdays. It's from 6 to 7, and if you miss it then, you can get it on one of their alternate stations from 9 to 10. And so I try and watch that religiously. But, you know, all these cable stations, I mean, I don't know. They really are skewed. And I mean, I'm very, very liberal, but they do, I want to see how people present it when they're speaking to a full audience also, you know?
I think that you're right. That certainly I've noticed that CNN has become very skewed.
For
Yeah.
sure.
And, you know,
Which is fine if it's your leaning direction.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, they know who their audience is. They know
They
who's
do.
on. So, you know, why try and be neutral if you don't have any?
No, because that's not where the audience is anymore at this point.
Exactly. Yep.
So how's everybody's week?
Just another week. They all feel like they're the same. Although my kids finished school this week, so we're officially transitioning to summer, whatever that means and whatever that looks like. I don't know.
Have they been doing the remote schooling?
Yeah, actually, my kids are at Trafton, and they actually did a really good job, I think, of transitioning to virtual learning. And they were really pretty much busy every day for a school day, not doing busy work, like legit learning. So I can't complain. They were busy during a school day. What more can I ask for
What grades are they?
6th and 7th?
Oh, yeah, they're older. Yeah.
Yeah.
They can just go off in their room and do their own thing. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the teachers gave them just enough direction to keep them engaged and going. And, you know, if they're busy until 3 or 4 o'clock every day, you know, what more can I ask for as parents stuck at home, you know?
Yeah, it's true.
What grade does Trafton go through till now?
It starts in
went there.
It used to be 4th through 8th, and now it starts in kindergarten, but it still goes through 8th.
Because Miss Wagner's merged with Trafton.
Exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we always joke if they did a fundraiser to build a high school, they could build it in a day because people love it and would love nothing more than to stay longer.
Right.
Yeah, my daughter went to public schools, Windsor Village, Vanguard, Johnston,
Mm-hmm.
the Magnet, and then Bel Air.
Mm-hmm.
I lived in the Johnston area too.
Yeah.
And, you know, back then they were good schools. She's already 38, I think, 36, 37, 38. So, but, you know, nowadays everything is so different. And I have a cousin whose granddaughter is going into the 9th grade. And she applied to 16 private schools and she still doesn't know what's going to happen. And I'm like, I thought, you know, if you're Jewish, you can go to Wiener. No, Wiener is hyper.
It's very hard to get in for 9th grade.
I had no idea.
Very hard to get in.
I had no idea it was so popular. Because, you know.
Well, so many of the kids stay from middle school that there's only a small, they expand just a little bit for the high school grades and they don't have that many people leave. So it's a really small group that they take in 9th grade.
School. It starts at middle school?
It starts, yeah, so it's I guess Wiener was in middle school.
That's her, I'm sorry, her granddaughter's going into 6th grade, not 8th grade. I'm making her.
Oh, well, that's like, I mean, now that's like applying for mini college. I mean,
I know, but it's
because we did the same thing for 2 years, applied to
Princeton or Harvard, yeah.
You have to take a test and you've got to do applications and, you know, some of them even have like little interviews. I mean, it's insane, you know, and it's, when I was a kid, you just went to school. Like, you know, there was none of this, you know.
Oh, right.
But I feel like with 6th grade and 9th grade, you know, it's like 2 shots at practicing for college applications. It's crazy.
It is. That's exactly what it's like. It's
crazy.
College in the 6th grade.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and even to get into public school, you still have to do all that.
My 2 grandsons up in Dallas are at St. Mark's,
mm-hmm.
and they're in 2nd and 3rd grade. They start at 1st grade. You have to go to kindergarten someplace else. So they went to their neighborhood school, which was fine, but, you know, they did want them in St. Mark's because it's really, you know, very nationally known. But she figured if she could get them in young, then they're in. You try and they do take kids transferring in, but the testing gets so much harder. So she had to employ a psychiatrist and get them tested. They're the ones that have the right test, certain psychiatrists. And then, not a psychologist with a lower fee, no. And then they have interview the parents. Then they interview the kids. And then the kids take a test.
Crazy.
And I'm talking about 1st grade.
Yeah.
But luckily they got in. And then they have a younger sister. Her score was like 20 points higher than the boys. Maybe like more like 15 points higher than both boys. But little girls all test higher than little boys at the same age.
At that age, right.
So, and they start theirs at preschool, not 1st grade, not kindergarten, it's preschool. So there were all these little girls, you know, up in, with their scores all up and down the 90s, and they had to decide on them by the interview with whether they were could follow orders and sit still in the chair longer than the
My
other.
kids would have failed that test.
Yeah, and my daughter said, my boys in preschool would not have gotten it either because I have a certain kind of parenting skill that allows them to do that. And they were way too immature back then. So she said, I'll keep trying with her. And in the meantime, she's at they have a Levine Academy, which is a conservative. Yeah.
I know one of the directors there that I used to work with.
It's a wonderful school.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to wait about 2 more minutes and then we'll get started, okay?
Sounds good.
How many people are in right now? 14.
There's more coming.
I know, but a lot of people don't have their screens on.
You want to see the faces, huh?
It doesn't really, it doesn't matter to me, really. It's not really interactive, so I guess it doesn't matter.
Erin, I enjoyed your article about the children of the Inquisition, and I'm looking forward to seeing that movie. When is it, Wednesday?
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Wednesday or Thursday? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I'll send out an email on Wednesday with the login information, and then you'll have to, actually we're going to have it until Sunday in case people can't get to watch it by Thursday night. Since it's Chag and it's Shabbat, we'll have it until Sunday I'm sure there'll be some people who'll see the discussion and say, I wish I'd have watched the movie. So we'll have it a little bit longer.
Well, I haven't signed up for it. Will you send it to everybody in this class also, please?
Yeah.
Okay. Because most of us might be the kind of people who want to see.
Well, you said
absolutely.
it was a limit of 100 for the Zoom.
Everyone will be able, we're going to actually turn it into a webinar, so we'll be able to have an unlimited number of people.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We realized that once it started coming in that we didn't even want to worry about the limit. So we're going to convert it to a webinar so everybody can see.
So, Erin, what is the focus of today's lecture?
I've entitled it "To Reform the Jews," and that doesn't mean to make all Jews reform Jews.
No, I get it.
So, where have we been the last couple of weeks? We've talked about the partitions of Poland, the 3 of them, and the 1.2 million Jews who became Russian subjects. So the Russian government at that point was forced to reconcile 2 historic opposites. One was the traditional anti-Jewish policy, which as recently as a generation earlier had not tolerated Jews within its borders, and the new reality that included a territory more densely populated by Jews than any other territory in Europe. So we're going to look at how did Jews fit into Russian society, if at all. And we're going to talk about the different options that were open at that point as the Russian government saw it. And these options would play out and continue to play out into contemporary Russia. One option, of course, was expulsion. All these Jews that now became part of the Tsarist Empire, throw them out, get rid of them. And we'll see that expulsion was considered to be a solution by some folks in the government, the reigning government headquarters in St. Petersburg. The second option was confined and keep autonomous. Remember, as I mentioned, that the Jews in Poland, the Jews who now, who lived in the Pale, in Poland, they were an autonomous nation. Basically, the Polish government left them alone, that the Kahals ran the Jewish communities. The Kahals dealt with the Polish government and now the Russian government, and the Jews were able to run their own affairs. So option 1, expulsion. Option 2, confine and keep autonomous. Option 3, ameliorate. We're going to talk about that, so put that aside for 1 second. Fourth option, correct and transform. And the fifth option, full rights. But full rights, as Russians, as we'll soon see, was really never an option in Tsarist Russia. So let's talk a little bit about the Committee for the Amelioration of the Jews. In 1803, under Alexander I, the Jews were restricted in their free expression of opinion. Among the committee members, there were two competing factions. One which advocated a series of correctional measures aimed at compulsory transformation of Jewish life. The second segment, the second faction, unconditional emancipation in a Western model without force. Now, as attractive as that sounds, because we look at what was happening in Western Europe when the Jews were being transformed in France and in Prussia, that was never a popular movement in Russia. I want to read to you a text by Mikhail Speransky. He was a Russian reformist, and he was close to Alexander I. He's known throughout Russian history as the father of Russian liberalism. So he was an example of unconditional emancipation using a Western model. He helped author a text that I'm taking this quote from on September 20, 1803, from the minutes of the Committee for the Amelioration of the Jews. Quote, reforms brought about by the power of the state are, as a rule, unstable and are particularly untenable in those cases in which that power has to grapple with the habits of centuries. Now again, habits of centuries, he's talking about the Jewish population. Hence, it seems better and safer to guide the Jews to perfection by throwing open to them the avenues leading to their own happiness, by observing their movements from a distance, and by removing everything that might turn them away from this path without using any manner of force, without establishing special agencies for them, without endeavoring to act in their stead, but by merely opening the way for their own activities. As few restrictions as possible, as many liberties as possible. Well, that sounds great, doesn't it? Well, as I said, that was a minority opinion which never gained much traction in St. Petersburg, because the outcome was the statute concerning the organization of the Jews in 1804. That statute, number one, limited locations where Jews could live, and it endeavored to transplant Jews from the villages, the shtetls, into the larger towns. It also abolished any rights to hold leases on land, to keep taverns, saloons, or inns, to sell wine in these locations. Remember I said in the former Polish eastern part of Poland, what were the main ways that Jews made a living? They worked for the Polish landowners. They ran inns, saloons, taverns. They sold alcoholic beverages. Well, this statute, what would that do economically to the Jewish population? It certainly wouldn't be good for them, that's for sure. The statute also imposed a double tax, one part going to the Kahals and one part going to the Russian municipality. It did allow Jews to buy unoccupied land if the Jews were willing to engage in agriculture. Now remember, who owned most of the land in eastern Poland? It was Polish nobility. They didn't work the land. They left it to the Jews to deal with the land and the locals who did the heavy work. A lot of the land was marginal land, forests, swamplands. And the Russian government, the Tsarist government, wished to make it productive land. So it allowed Jews to buy these marginal lands if the Jews were willing to engage in agriculture. The statute also allowed access to all public schools, allowed Jews access to all public schools in Russia. It granted Jews the rights to open their own schools as long as the classes were conducted in Russian, Polish, or German. It made all public documents and members of the Kahal had to be fluent in writing and speaking Russian, Polish, or German. And it made sure that all Jews had to wear clothes of the Polish, Russian, or German pattern. So basically, the statute was not to make Jews autonomous, was not to leave Jews the way they are. It was to make them into assimilated citizens in the Tsarist state. However, history intervened as a way of happening often as we look backward. Napoleon shattered Prussia and convened a Jewish parliament in Paris in 1806. He called it the Sanhedrin, of course. And as French armies approached the borders of Russia, the Tsar worried that Jewish resentment would create anti-Russian feelings in what would become the next theater of war. Now, do we have any doubts as to whether the Poles welcomed Napoleon? How many think the Poles welcomed Napoleon? Why? Because basically they thought that if Napoleon conquered and beat the Tsar, that he would free Poland and Poland would once again be an independent country. What about the Jews?
Because they weren't the Russians, that's why.
Yes, that's true. How many think that the Jews would be pro-French in case of war? How many think that the Jews would be pro-Tsarist Russia in case of war? Okay. What did the Russian government do? It first of all gave the Jews the right to elect deputies and to solicit through these deputies Jewish views. Again, history intervened. Napoleon and Alexander I reach an entente in July of 1807. Now, the entente didn't last, as we know. But as soon as the entente was signed between the French and the Russians, bureaucratic compassion for the Jews vanished. And they set out a policy of transplantation of the Jewish populations over a 3-year period, beginning in 1808. The idea was to expel the Jews from the Pale of Settlement. And forceful expulsions began. Distress reached such levels that the Russian governors reported that it was impossible to carry out the expulsion decree without subjecting the Jews to complete ruin. Why? Number one, where were they going to go? Number two, what were they going to do once they reached these new locations? Even the idea of making Jews into farmers, there was no follow-up. In the cases where the Jews were exiled to become farmers, there was no equipment, there were no shelters, and many of the Jews did not have the knowledge of how to be farmers. You don't suddenly go to a place and learn how to grow crops to support yourself. So seeing that was a no-win situation, a new ukase was issued. Leave the Jews in their domiciles pending special imperial orders. And a new committee was formed. That sounds typically bureaucratic, doesn't it? You have a policy, it doesn't work, so what do you do first? You establish a new committee to study the situation. So a new committee was appointed to examine all phases of the problem. And the committee found that to transfer all village Jews to towns and cities was the answer. Now the idea was to convert them into manufacturers, merchants, and artisans. But until that happened, to allow the Jews to remain in their formal abodes. Okay, so that put an end to the forced transfer of Jews temporarily. Meanwhile, Napoleon invaded Russia. Now, most of the war between Napoleon and Russia was fought in Western Russia, the area that the Pale of Settlement was in. The Poles were mostly on Napoleon's side. They hoped for a restoration of the Polish kingdom. Mostly Jewish opinion was on Alexander's side. Now remember, this is before the Jews were drafted into the Tsarist army. A minority of the Jews saw Napoleon as the herald of liberalism and emancipation, but Orthodox and Hasidic leadership were suspicious of Napoleon's motives and saw his reform schemes as subversive of Judaism. One outstanding example of Jewish leadership at the time was Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Anybody familiar? Hands, anybody familiar with that name? He's the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad. And he used a network of his disciples to track the eastward movements of the French army and report those movements to Russian authorities. Now, according to the Chabad tradition, Reb Zalman regarded Napoleon as the complete antithesis of anything godly, a man whose extreme egotism would lead him first to the depths of depravity, throwing away tens of thousands of lives for nothing, more for his own glory, and ultimately lead to his defeat. And in addition, French invasion of Russia ignited pro-Russian patriotic feelings. So the government, by allowing Jews to remain in their places of residence and taking note of pro-Russian Tsarist feelings of the Jewish community, after the Russian victory, began to have a change of heart towards the Jewish population. In addition, Tsar Alexander grew mystically inclined. Well, he had just stopped the French invasion. And remember that the Tsar was very close to the Russian Orthodox Church. The Tsar saw himself as an instrument of divine providence. And part of this tendency towards mysticism is he found a group called the Society of Israelite Christians. The goal of this society was to prepare Jews for conversion to the Russian Orthodox religion, Catholicism, or Lutheranism. And we know in history that the organization had very limited success, although Reb Zalman's son did convert to Catholicism. It's a little footnote of history that's not well known. Let's talk a little bit about Chabad. I call Chabad the most Russian of all the Hasidic sects in Eastern Europe. Why? Well, Shneur Zalman, the Alter Rebbe, believed that the tzaddik's role was to be an educator and spiritual guide. The Hasidic message could be spread. He also believed that the Hasidic message could be spread less through educated followers and more through the common Am Haaretz, person of the earth. Okay? Now, this idea was in direct conflict with the Orthodox feeling that it was only the most educated and trained and Jewish elite that real messages of Judaism could be spread. The common man, the common person, had no place amongst the Orthodox. Why? Because they weren't scholars. The Alter Rebbe felt different about that. He also did not believe in listening to personal problems or sorrows of his followers. That distracted him from the worship of God. So he restricted his time spent with those who came to his court. However, the one thing that the Alter Rebbe established was a large and well-organized network. Now we know that today, the Chabad movement enjoys success in the United States and around the world, largely because of the Shlachim, the network that the Rebbes who headed Chabad used to send out. This network was well positioned to deal with the broader communal affairs. And the Rebbe took a very active role in Russian politics at the time. This was unlike the Jewish Kahals throughout most of the Pale. For example, the Rebbe won a release for 30 Jews who were imprisoned and in danger of being sent to Siberia. He also directly helped tens of thousands of Jews who were fleeing expulsion from the shtetls in the Pale of settlement. Now, the Rebbe's sermons were collected in a book called Lichutei Amarim, known to the Chabad followers as the Tanya. What the Rebbe said was the ordinary person, the Benoni, the in-between person, is engaged inwardly in a constant battle between good, that is the divine element that every Jew possesses, and evil, the Yetzer Hara, and that the goal of worship is to impose the rule of Chochmah, Bina, and Da'at, wisdom, insight, and knowledge. Chochmah, the Chet, Bina, the Bet, Da'at, the Dalet, which is the acronym from Chabad. The goal of every Jew is to overcome one's desires, animal self. And we'll see in the future how the competition between the Orthodox community and Chabad and the other Hasidic communities plays out. Question, Alan?
I wondered how the Rebbe gained influence with the Tsar. What was his role and what was the Tsar getting out of it?
Well, again, the big deal was that he used his network to follow the French army when it invaded Russia, to report to the Tsar the movement of the army. And he acted basically like, he and his network acted like military spies for the Tsar and the Tsar's army. Now, this was not expected, but it proved to be crucial in the war. And the Tsar was forever grateful. That's really the way that the change was made. And that the fact that that the Rebbe encouraged his followers to take that active role, not just to sit on the sidelines. There's all kinds of stories in Chabad lore about the crucial role that the Alter Rebbe played in turning the tide of the French invasion to the Russians' advantage. We don't know historically how decisive a role the Rebbe played, but he did play a major role. Does that answer your question? Okay, let's jump to 1830 and 1831. So two things happened during these 2 years, two critical things. There was a famine throughout the Ukraine, and there was the Polish uprising. It seems to almost impossible to believe that, remember we said the last partition was in 1796, that here we are in 1830, and for the most part, the Polish nobility in the Pale of Settlement had not been dislodged, either politically or economically, from ruling these lands. Well, it also tells you how backwards that area of Russia was. But that was the fact. So the famine, of course, created economic dislocation. The Polish uprising created political dislocation. In these 2 years, the Poles militarily went to war against the Russians, hoping to overthrow and restore the Polish, at least, the Russian part of the Polish government that was partitioned. So once again, the Tsar had another committee. What should we do after the Polish uprising and the famine? And the committee recommended setting up a network of schools for Jewish children where they would learn the Russian language and history, loyalty to the state, and the importance of taking up useful occupations. The Tsar also ordered state certification of all rabbis, separate Jewish dress forbidden. It abolished the kahals and the kosher meat tax. Why would abolishing the kosher meat tax be important? Remember, we talked about that last class. As I said, the two main sources of income to the kahals was a tax on income and a tax on consumption. Once again, the Jews were encouraged to go into useful occupations. So what were the outcomes of these recommendations? First of all, there was the creation of a network of state-sponsored Jewish schools. Second of all, in 1844, Now remember, again, we talk about how things move so slowly in Russia. 1830 was the famine and the Polish uprising. 1844 was the law that abolished the Kahals. The Eastern Europe, 14 years it took them to get to that point. Now the response, you abolished the Kahals, who's going to be responsible for collecting taxes? That's the next question. You would think it would be Russian officials, right? Wrong. Even though the Kahals were abolished, the Kahals were made responsible for collecting taxes. So why was that? Basically because the Russian government at that time lacked the administrative resources to appoint all these tax collectors throughout the Pale of Settlement. The second reason was even if they had been able to get enough Russian bureaucrats to move to the Pale of Settlement, to settle and start collecting taxes, that would have resulted in writing off substantial arrears in taxation that were owed by the Jewish Kehilot. And they didn't want to lose those back taxes because that apparently was a substantial amount. There were also laws that were passed, once again, banning the specific forms of Jewish dress, including the wearing of kippahs, yarmulkes, in public, side locks, and women shaving their heads after they were married. What was the Jewish reaction to these laws? What do you guys think?
I'm sure the Rebbe wasn't very happy.
That's for sure. Most Jews refused to observe these decrees. And you could pay a tax to get out of conforming to these decrees. And the majority of the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, the vast majority of the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, were willing to pay a tax as long as they didn't have to change their costumes, the wearing of the kippahs in public, and so forth. Now, a couple of classes ago, somebody asked me about Jewish farmers. Okay, during this time, the number of Jewish farmers grew from approximately 3,600. Now remember, what was the population, the Jewish population in the Pale? 1.2 million, right? There were approximately 3,600 Jewish farmers in the Pale in 1830, according to the Russian government, to over 15,000 in 1851, 3,600 to 15,000. So that's approximately a five-fold increase. But that's still not a huge number of Jewish farmers, is it? None of these movements created a body of modernized Jews on the French and German models. None of these transformed the mass of Jews into useful subjects. What these laws did do was it undermined the authority of the traditional Jewish leadership without putting anything effective in its place. Moreover, it created a gulf between the small group of Westernizers and those who believed in integration and assimilation into the greater Russian society, and who were trusted by the Russian authorities, and the overwhelming majority of Jews who saw the Russian government as deeply hostile, persecutory, and set on conversion. Any questions?
effective was the conversion movement?
Not very effective at all at this point.
I would expect just that.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why is, again, as we'll see in the in the next class, as a matter of fact, assimilation grew adherence among Jews when there was an opportunity, like there was in France and Germany, to really and truly integrate into the larger society and economically and culturally make a better life for yourself. The reality is, in Tsarist Russia, these opportunities really and truly did not exist for Jews. There was a combination of Russian attitude, of opportunities not existing economically, period, and Russian economic class doing its damnedest to keep the Jews out of economic opportunities. Also, the Industrial Revolution had not hit yet, so that there weren't the economic opportunities that existed like they did in Prussia and France. There just were no opportunities for Jews to become economically successful. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I think I missed something. You said that they abolished the Kahal, but they didn't replace it with Russian leaders. Who did they replace it with? Somehow I missed that part.
Well, basically, it was a Kahal it was a Jewish organization that functioned and did the same things as the Kahal, but without the power that the Kahal had.
Okay.
So it was a Kahal in function, but without the power that the Kahal had to enforce, for example, when people were called to the Jewish court, it had no power to enforce going to a Jewish court. And when your rulers basically have the power to collect taxes and to make sure that you fulfill your service in the Russian military, that doesn't endear you to your rulers, does it?
I have one other question.
Yeah.
Or one comment. When you tell people to assimilate, they also can be excommunicated from their whole family, and families were big back then. Like, the Mormons. Most Mormons do not really believe their liturgy about what happened to Joseph Smith, back in Pennsylvania or wherever it was. They don't believe any of that stuff, but they have huge families that they would be totally cut off from if they decided to become Episcopalian or Methodist, so they stay.
That's true. And remember, we're talking about the majority of Jews living in villages. You live in a village and you're excommunicated, and you can't exactly move to the big city. You don't have the option of leaving. The option basically is to stay in the village. But if you're excommunicated, what do you have? You're cut off from family, you're cut off from friends, you're cut off from neighbors. What options are left to you to make a living, to have a social life? In France and Germany, assimilationist Jews had the option of moving to big cities. They had the option of having a life with other masculine, other people who were educated and believed in the Enlightenment. the Russian Jews basically did not have this option. It didn't exist at this point. It wouldn't really exist until around the 1870s, 1880s, which we'll talk about the next class. And that's a pretty late date, isn't it? When we think about the Enlightenment. Other questions? Okay, then. I want to thank everybody for participating. Have yourselves a good week. Jennifer, thank you for all your help.
Always my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And thanks everybody for coming to class today.
Thank you, Aaron.
Aaron, can I ask you a question? How do I get
Sure.
handouts? How do I access the handouts? Are there handouts?
Yeah, there are. Hey, how about we do this? If that's okay with you, Jennifer. I'll send
Yeah.
you handouts.
Yeah, and I'll put them on the website where the event is on our calendar. And then the next time I send out the link to everybody for the class, I'll include the link to where the handouts are so you can find them easily.
Okay, are you sending out the link? Because that's why I was late to class. I couldn't find the link and I had to search and search.
Did you get an email from me on Friday?
I don't think I did. And
Okay,
that-
then I'll make sure that I've got everybody in there. But what I did, so the link for all the classes is the same. So now that you have the link,
Right.
you can use this one for all of them.
Okay,
But I'll send out a reminder before the class with the link so you can just click on it and come right to it. But I'll include
Great.
a link to the handouts.
Great.
Deborah, let me suggest something.
Yeah.
Flag the email so you have it in your special section for flagged emails,
I'll have
so you can find it easily.
to figure out how to do that. I've never flagged an email, but I will. Okay.
Just mark it
I've
as a
seen
gold
that
star.
somewhere.
A gold
Okay.
star. But, you know, also check your spam file to make sure it didn't end up there somehow.
Okay.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay.
If you use
Thank you.
a calendar, like an Outlook calendar or a Gmail calendar, you can also, once you have the link, you can copy and paste it into your calendar, and then you don't ever have to look for it again. If you use an electronic calendar, that's just another way to avoid having to search through your emails to find it again later.
Thank
Okay.
you, Jennifer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.